All right, so we just had John O'Derna on a couple segments ago, and he said that in his opinion, this might be the most intriguing NCAA tournament that's ever been played. Even just quarterfinal weekend, three of those four games were just as good as it gets in college lacrosse. I know there's some recency bias here, Terry, but would you say this is one of, if not, the best NCAA tournament we've seen to date? I know the Final Four hasn't been played yet, but these early rounds, is this as good as it's been?
Yeah, so I've done this mathematically by evaluating comebacks, overtimes, upsets, all that sort of stuff. And we haven't updated it for the 2025 year, but the competition is 2019. I don't know if you remember, but that year, 3 quarterfinal games went to overtime, and there were a couple of epic high-scoring affairs. And so when you consider how incredible the Harvard-Syracuse first-round game was, in addition to some of the upsets that we saw, in addition to how this past quarterfinal was, I think, when it comes down to it, trying to apply something quantitative to something that I don't think anybody really wants to math the numbers, it can still be helpful. And I think once we get down to the nitty gritty of all that, it'll turn out that if 2025 isn't the best tournament in the history, or at least since 2003 when they expanded to 16 teams, it's right up there in the running for it.
Yeah, and again, just specifically with Syracuse, these two NCAA tournament games have been, both have been instant classics. They were dead and buried against Harvard in that second half and somehow came alive and won the game. And then all the twists and turns against Princeton in a 1918 thriller. They fall behind with like 4.5 minutes to go, and they still find a way to get it done. What have you seen? I mean, it's been a roller coaster ride for this Syracuse squad. I mean, what has impressed you the most about this group? The fact that they started preseason number 2, fell out of the top 10 multiple times throughout the year, and now they're in the Final Four. What has impressed you the most, I guess, about this group?
So it's hard for me to separate out their variability, their ability to win in a couple of different ways, with the resilience and more acutely, they're having learned how to win, if that makes sense. It was something that I talked a lot about between 2023 and 2024. 2023, that team was talented, but there were so many freshmen that they were relying upon that they hadn't learned how to win. They hadn't even learned how to navigate a college lacrosse season. And I think you saw that with how the season advanced. In 2024, by virtue of some of the grad transfers, particularly, Jake Stevens and Sammy English, who had made it to the Final Four with Princeton, there was this infusion of having learned how to win at the highest level, with the fact that all the freshmen had become sophomores and they understood how a college lacrosse season unfolded. I think that when the rubber meets the road, which is the quarterfinals, there is something organic that has to have happened. And I think that's what we saw against Denver in Towson in May of 2024. That group, even though there were a handful of guys on it that had experienced winning at the highest level, they just didn't quite have enough to get over the hump. And I think that's the difference between last year and this year. Even though there is another year's worth of growth built into the core of this team, because so many of them are juniors, there's a lot more knowledge of how to win. And I think that ultimately is what was the deciding factor against Princeton.
You look at this matchup now with Maryland, and Maryland's had SU's number. They've won 7 straight games. They beat them back in mid-February. We know about John Tillman, and when he's got a week to prepare, how good he is. And I know that you're a big fan of this Maryland team in terms of how good they are. I guess what stands out to you the most about Maryland, and what is the biggest challenge, I guess, for Syracuse going into this semifinal game against the Terps?
I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday who made the argument that this might be the best job that John Tillman has done coaching in College Park, which is an incredible statement when you consider everything that he's done and what he's put together. And I think that there's some merit to it, because when you consider what the strengths of their team that made it to the championship game last year, and how unlikely that seemed when they were going up against Duke in the quarterfinals, to this year, it was really, so much of that team was kind of built around Luke Weirman, one of the best faceoff guys in the country, and Ajax Zapatello, the Schmeisser Award winner. Both those guys graduated, and yet this team, which had the same question marks offensively that they did last year, doesn't have either of those two things to rely upon, and yet they're still able to do this. They're still able to perform at this level. So, in some ways, it's a similar kind of story as Syracuse in terms of what impressed me. It's the combination of their variability and their resilience, but it's much different insofar as it's built into the culture at Maryland. It's built into what is expected. It's not something that we're seeing happen for the first time like we are with Gary Gate and his team. And so as a result, there's just a little bit of a difference when it comes to the Terps and how you kind of spin that forward with respect to making expectations for Memorial Day weekend and on Monday.
How do you see this game playing itself out? Because it is certainly a contrast in styles. We just saw Syracuse put up 19 goals against Princeton. They're not putting up 19 against Maryland. We know Maryland wants to play slow and methodical and keep you in single digits. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But how do you see this one playing itself out?
Yeah, I think that ultimately so much about being able to set the pace and tempo comes down to possession and who's going to win possession. And that was one of the things about the Syracuse-Princeton game that surprised me the most. I really expected Johnny Mullen to dominate the faceoff and as a result, Syracuse to control the tempo of the game. And really what was even more impressive about that was coming in, even though so much of Syracuse's identity is around their offense, it was Princeton's offense that was the more reliable unit over the course of the year. And so I'm kind of on my heels a little bit when it comes to, all right, are we going to see a Johnny Mullen bounce back game and he's going to dominate against Jonah Carrier and Shea Kiefler and Sean Creeder? Or is Maryland going to figure out a way to muck it up and, some of the jump in the whistle violation issues that we saw against Princeton are going to manifest? If Maryland can control the game, then I think you're right. I think that you're probably going to see a final score in that, 12-10 type of range. But if Syracuse is going to dominate possession, I actually think that we might see Maryland rely a little bit more on early offense. They have really excelled at that at times this year. I mean, they've struggled. It was a huge part of the reason that they lost to Michigan in the regular season. But against Notre Dame in the regular season, against Penn State in the regular season, and even against Ohio State in the regular season, that was a huge part of why they were able to generate a lot of good scoring looks. And I think it's a pretty common thing when you've got an offensive unit that isn't super reliable in settled 6-on-6 offense. If Maryland tries to push, then it's going to be this weird inversion for Syracuse where, if they get a transition stop, then they have to make the decision, do we want to go slow offensively and really wear down this Maryland defense, right? So if in a 3-minute span, they're playing 2.5 minutes worth of defense, that's going to show up in the fourth quarter. So I think that it's going to depend a little bit on if Syracuse wins faceoffs, I can imagine Maryland trying to play faster. And if Maryland tries to play faster, then Syracuse is going to have to decide, do we want to get in a track meet with this team, or do we want to try to beat them with their own game and wear them down a little bit?
Interesting. Fascinating storyline there. And you look at the other semifinal game, Terry, and, a bunch of fascinating storylines with that one. Jeff Tambroni, local guy here, went to West Genesee, coached at Cornell for 10 years. Now he's going up against his former team, a team that they beat this year. It's a rematch. Cornell's only loss came to Penn State in overtime. What do you make of this other semifinal matchup between the Big Red and Nittany Lions?
So I think that it's easy to say that result happened because of the late non-releasable penalty against Jack Escadden and the way that Penn State was able to utilize that to close a gap late and ultimately win the game in overtime. But I do think that overlooks some of the matchup assets that Penn State has at both ends of the field. And so I would just say this is a really close game on paper, maybe even closer than either the seeding or the Vegas betting lines or some of the kind of intellectual prognostication might suggest. But there's no question that it's even richer in narrative than it is in storyline. I think that one of the things that I'm really curious and interested in is Jeff Tambroni found Connor Busick. He was a player from Cincinnati, Ohio, who wasn't going to get a ton of other looks, I don't think. And then Tambo came calling, and all of a sudden, 15 years later, they're matching up against each other in a Final Four. And Connor is obviously one of the best and brightest young coaches in the game, and now with an opportunity to make it back to the national championship game for the second time in 4 seasons, it's pretty remarkable. But obviously, one of the other storylines is Jeff Tambroni going back to Gillette Stadium. And, I was fortunate by virtue of coincidence to walk down the tunnel underneath the stadium after the end of the 2009 national championship game and just kind of observe him process that. And I feel like in the intervening 16 years, he and I have had a lot of conversations. He's gone through a tremendous amount of professional moments, highs and lows. And, for this to be so fateful, I suppose, and take it back to Gillette Stadium is just incredibly, incredibly rich.
Yeah, we saw Jim Beheim do that, right? Lost to Indiana in the Superdome, and then he got his one and only championship, in the Superdome, and kind of, exercised those demons, and so we certainly get it here. I wasn't planning on asking you this, but since you bring up 2009 and Tambroni, and you've had conversations with him, how does he, in all this time removed, how has he processed kind of what happened? For that championship to slip away that day? Is he over it? Is it something that he will never be over? How has he processed it over the course of these last 15 years or so?
Yeah, well, I don't want to speak for him, and I certainly don't want to make it seem like I am closer to the situation than I am. But I have spoken to him about it a couple times, and I think that the best way to describe it is he's so process-oriented, and he is so sports, and things happen, and that's why we love it, right? That's why it is the human drama. I know that he has second guessed and thought about alternative decisions that he could have made, but I also know that he doesn't spend a lot of time on that because he knows that there's nothing he can do about it. And one of the things that makes him such a great coach and has allowed him, to take Cornell to multiple Final Fours and now to take Penn State to its third Final Four is by being so process oriented. And I'm sure that he's going to get asked about it. I'm sure he's already been asked about it a lot this week. I'm sure that he's going to deflect and demur the answers as much as possible. I'm sure he's going to think about it when he gets back out on the field. But ultimately, I think he knows that it's not going to have an effect on what goes on once the whistle blows on Saturday, or God willing for Penn State fans on Monday.
All right, so it's prediction time, and we had you on prior to the ACC tournament, and you spoke it into existence. You said Syracuse is going to win the ACC tournament. I'm not sure you 100% believed it, but it certainly came to fruition. What do you make of the two semifinal matchups? Kind of walk us through who wins both of them and why, and who ultimately is cutting down the nets.
Well, let me caveat this by saying that I picked Notre Dame to win the national championship, so my bracket is busted, and you should fade all of my picks. When it comes to this one, we're early enough in the week that I'm going to reserve my right to switch. I'm working out the problem on the chalkboard right now. I feel like I am very afraid to pick against Maryland because of their experience, because their familiarity with the stage on Saturday. So I think if it weren't the Final Four, I'd probably pick Syracuse because I think that, number one, I think they're more talented and a better team. And number two, because they lost the first matchup this season, I think that they have the advantage of incentive to change. But it is the Final Four, and the stage is very big. And John Tillman is the best at preparing his team for that stage. And so as a result, I'm going to have to pick the Terps. I apologize to Syracuse fans listening.
No, it's okay.
And on the other side, I'm going to go with Cornell. I think that one of the great things about lacrosse is it kind of sits in the middle of the influence one player can have on a game. It's not basketball where one player can take over and dominate, but it's also not football. And so one player does have the potential to be able to influence things. I was really surprised by how sluggish Cornell looked at times against Richmond, and yet the power of will, and led by CJ Kurse. I mean, his stat line, 2 goals, 2 assists, not eye-popping for him. 10 ground balls and 3 caused turnovers. That is, to me, the indication of a leader who was willing his team to win, wasn't going to allow them to lose. And I think that is the type of thing that manifests over the course of the quarterfinals, the semifinals, and championship. And so, I'm going to pick the Big Red in the other semifinal, and then I'm going to kind of parlay those two things into Monday. Obviously the Terps record on Monday is not the Terps record on quarterfinal weekend or semifinal Saturday. And I do believe in CJ Kurse's power to will the Big Red back to their first national championship since 1977.
Yeah, it's been a while for them, and that would certainly be something. Central New York's going to be well represented, I tell you that. A lot of fans going to Foxborough to root on Cornell, root on Syracuse. We'll be there as well. Terry, I know you'll be there. Thanks so much for coming on. We really do appreciate the time, and enjoy what should be a great week of lacrosse.
Thanks, guys. You as well.
All right, Terry Foy, CEO from Inside Lacrosse, joining us here on the program. And with that, we'll open up the phone lines the rest of the way. 315-437-7644. We're back after this on ESPN Radio.
Good job, Steve.